Good afternoon all, and thanks for joining our presentation today. We're going to do a couple of things today. Firstly, we're going to have a look at some of the attacks that have been happening in the news recently. You can't have failed to be aware that quite a few of the retailers in the UK have been cyber attacked essentially. And we're going to look at kind of a little bit about how that happened. We're also going to look at, once the hack has happened, what happens? What happens to the data that they take away, and where does the data end up? We've then got Alex from Huntress. So Huntress is our security product that we partner with, and he's going to explain about how it works, what it can do, and how it stops this type of attack. So the first thing we're going to talk about is Marks and Spencer. Obviously, it's been in the news, and they've had a significant attack over the last probably 2-3 weeks, something like that. The attack route for Marks and Spencer was quite interesting. So rather than somebody doing something silly on a PC, they actually compromised the help desk. So as we run a help desk here, some of you may know who are on the call, you can ring up and get a password reset. So in some way, and it's not quite clear at the moment how it happened, that procedure was compromised. So somebody called up the help desk and probably using publicly available information. So he went on somebody's Facebook, looked at the name of the dog, looked at the name of the mother, that kind of thing. Whatever the procedure to reset the password was, they were able to do it. Once they got a password reset, the hacker was then able to access the network. Now, obviously, the network is open because people need to be able to access VPN from home or remote desktop or whatever route they get into to work from home. So they got onto the network, and from that, they were then able to use those credentials they got. They were only user-level credentials, but use those credentials they got to connect to a machine somewhere, probably a server or something like that. They then, and I talked about this with Wayne, our cyber guy, at some point, they were able to use those credentials to have more access than they should have done. So there was some privilege escalation somewhere, which allowed them to have access to a PC. Once they got access to that operating system machine, they were then able to use lateral movement to move between machines. They could then start to access domain controllers, and there's some flaws in Windows that enable you to do this if you've got too many privileges on a local PC. Once it accessed that domain controller, they were able to exploit this that they got and exploit the ntds.dip file. What that means is it's basically a file within Active Directory that holds all of the passwords. Those passwords are encrypted, but they have to be held somewhere so that when somebody tries to log in, the domain controllers can refer to those passwords. Once they got that file, they took it away. They then run password cracking tools against that file. So the file was then basically all the passwords that they could get out of that file were, and including administration passwords for the network. Once they got that, they got keys to the kingdom. So they then started to extract data. So they moved laterally in the network, whether it's through RDP or SSH or whatever tool they used to move through the network, and started finding customer lists, email addresses, PII data for customers, maybe some of the card information if they had it, all that type of stuff, and then extracted it. Once they got that data, they picked a time, whenever it was, probably over a weekend, and ransomware the network. That meant that none of the machines were able to be accessed, that they'd ransomwared, and when they came in the morning, all the data was obfuscated and you couldn't use it. So the challenge with that, it's fairly obvious that they then had to shut down their online sales. They were unable to ship product out to their stores. They were unable to internally communicate. They didn't know who owed them money, who they owed money to. Really a major problem for them. And according to their website, whether it's correct or not, they're at about £300 million of lost revenue. And obviously they've got problems with their customers now, that they've lost customer data is going to cost them, and they're still unable to trade online. They're hoping to get back online probably in the next couple of months, but the stores are still working. Interestingly, at the same time, the Co-op had a similar attack. So the routing was exactly the same by the IT help desk compromise and the credential abuse, and they then got into the network and started to steal data. They took the customer lists again, they took the card holder data, not the actual cards because they were processed elsewhere, but the card holder data, so that they caught club card type information. But it holds PII, so people's addresses, names, and histories of what they bought, things like that. However, the co-op spotted them. So somehow their tool set, whatever it was, they spotted them in the network, and they took the view that they were going to pull the plug. So they pulled the plug on their external access of their network, and the hackers couldn't encrypt the data on the network. They couldn't ransomware it because their routing was lost. However, they still had the same problem. They couldn't ship product, and especially because all the remote access was gone, it was a bit difficult because the stores weren't able to communicate properly. And you may have noticed if you went into a local co-op that the shelves were empty and they had big stickers everywhere saying it's due to a cyber attack, and unfortunately we can't ship product out to the stores. Again, it's a reputational problem, and again they've got problems with their customer data being leaked. Once that customer data is leaked, it goes out and it ends up on the dark web. Dark web is a place where you can't just find it in a browser, but what it does is a repository for hackers or people that, dodgy people, to store data and be able to exchange it. As part of one of the things we do in our cybersecurity packages is we monitor the dark web. So if somebody's credentials or somebody's information ends up on the dark web, we get an alert for it basically, and we can then choose to rotate passwords, things like that. So if you could just share my screen, Laura, I'll show how it works. So, for example, I stuck Tesco's in there because obviously clearly that's going to be some kind of firm that's going to have a lot of attacks. If you look down here though, you can see all the passwords that have been basically extracted. Now, however it happened, whether it was in terms of a phishing attack, or maybe even an old LinkedIn attack or something like that, or they put the details in another website that got compromised, but the passwords are there and you can see them. And I presume this one is something to do with Tesco's, but you can see that there's a lot there. And as you keep going down, there's more and more and more of them. So, and we can run this for anybody. So if anybody at the end of the presentation wants to put in the chat, wants me to run this, not a problem at all for them. I'm happy to do it for you. And as a proactive thing, we can monitor this for you. So that's kind of what's happened recently. However, there is a solution to this, or something that can certainly really assist in stopping this type of attack. I don't know whether the large companies had it or not. I doubt it, because it would have certainly helped them prevent what happened to them. So I think I'll introduce Alex now. Alex is from Huntress, the product we use, and he's going to explain how it works and give us a bit of background on the product.
Yeah, absolutely. Nice to meet you all today. My name's Alex. I'm a sales engineer here at Huntress. So I'm responsible for technical demonstrations of our product and explaining how it works, essentially. So today I'm going to run through two main products that we have, EDR and ITDR, and I'll do a quick explanation of how they differentiate. So can I just confirm that you can see my screen okay? All good?
Yeah, all good. Thanks, Alex.
So I'm going to start with EDR and jump into the EDR dashboard here. So many of you will be running some sort of antivirus on your devices already, I hope. And in a lot of cases, that will be Windows Defender. So antivirus is essentially signature-based malware detection. So detection of known bad malware. What happens when attackers are evolving their techniques, becoming more sophisticated, circumnavigating those basic controls of a Windows Defender antivirus? Well, that's where EDR comes in, and more importantly, managed EDR, in which Huntress provides. So EDR is looking for those detections beyond the traditional antivirus mechanism. Things like malicious process behaviors, persistent footholds, early indications of ransomware deployments. So I'll jump into those specific detections a little bit now. So what we have here on our dashboard is our incidents categorized by their severities, so we can track our incidents. But if I jump into some specific detections of things that we've found before. So persistent footholds. This is a mechanism where attackers gain initial access to a device and they want to maintain persistence. They want to keep access to your device. So whether you're rebooting, going about your daily activities, they want to maintain that persistence. And they do that in a few ways. First of all, things like remote access Trojans. So ways in which they can remotely access your device from somewhere else in the world. Auto run scripts that run when you boot up your device. So even though you're rebooting, you're not kicking that attacker out of the device. They're maintaining that persistent access. So I'm going to look at some incidents that we've detected within the Huntress platform here in the demo environment. So we've got our organization, Springfield Power, and we have our entity, Homer Simpson. And we can see the timestamps, the platforms that we used, some remediations. So we're going to click into this specific incident and take a view of what we've detected. So it's really important to mention that you don't have to be a security expert to understand Huntress. The incident reports are written in plain English language, and we work hand in glove with Sirion to go through the investigations and auto-remediate. So I'm going to take a look at this specific example here. So as I say, it's plain English and anyone can understand it. So Huntress detected the following on this host: a rogue Screen Connect install. Huntress has been tracking a number of malicious threat actors, convincing users via email into running a malicious Screen Connect. And these installers give the threat actor remote access to the host. So clear indication of what's happened and what the impact is. We've got the evidence that suggests at this timestamp, the user, Homer Simpson, was phished into visiting a fake Social Security Administration website. We've got the domain there. It automatically downloaded a rogue Screen Connect executable from this domain. It was installed on the host, and it gave the threat actor remote access to that machine. We've got the further evidence. We found that this user was downloading a handful of other malicious files throughout the day. And we've got the remediation instructions. So for those technical people amongst you, you could go through these remediation instructions and do this yourself if you so wished. You could run these types of scripts. You could remove the malicious files. You could block domains. Or with the service through Huntress and Sirion, we could automatically provide the remediations directly through this dashboard. So not only do we have detections of the technology detecting this instance of malicious behavior, we also have a 24/7, 365 team that are continuously monitoring your environment and these detections with their eyes on screen. And they're proactively taking remediation steps to stop those devices from moving laterally, accessing other resources and infecting other areas of the network. So we can push down these auto remediations. We can delete the services, the malicious services, the registry keys, malicious files. We can remove those and reboot the host if required. So when I talk about the isolation here specifically, if we identify that a device has been infected with malware, with ransomware, we take steps to isolate that device on the network. Make sure it can't infect other devices in your environment or access other resources. Much like if someone got COVID during the lockdown, we would quarantine them in their home, not let them out and infect other people in the world. That's how we isolate those devices, prevent them from infecting other areas of the network. And you can request SOC support here. So as I say, 24/7 team, 365, consistently available on live chat, email, phone call to run through these incident reports and make sure you're remediated effectively. I'm going to take a look at process insights here. So this is another form of detection that we see. Around 40% of our detections are coming from process insights. So as I've said, AV is about that signature-based malware, but process insights is that deeper level of things that aren't necessarily caught by antivirus and Windows Defender. Things like clicking on an attachment for Excel that has an embedded macro in it. That macro runs a malicious PowerShell script in the background that exfiltrates data, that accesses other devices. We're looking for instances of that malicious behavior as it resides on the endpoint. So detecting those instances there and then and putting those interventions in place before they can worsen or move laterally within your environment and access other areas. Now we have ransomware canaries. So much like the canary in the coal mine, when the canary alerted the miners that the environment became unsafe, the miners could come back up to the surface. And we're doing a similar thing here. So essentially we're placing files in strategic locations within the endpoint. And we know if those files start to become encrypted, that's highly indicative of a ransomware attack scenario in progress. So we get those early warning signs that those ransomware canaries are starting to be encrypted, and we can take those interventions immediately to stop that device becoming fully encrypted and ransomware and stopping it to move laterally and infect other areas of the network and become a business-wide outage in the case that we've seen through M&S. So initially that ransomware attack starts on one singular device, but it moves, it spreads. So we're looking at that early warning sign and putting those interventions in place there and then. And we can see here through our canaries that are tripped, and we can drill into those directly. We can view that information. Next, we have external reconnaissance. So this is looking at the external attack service of your devices. So your devices that have the EDR agent rolled out, like servers. So some servers in your environment, hopefully not, may have externally facing or publicly accessible ports. Things like RDP and SSH, which attackers can see, they can access, and they can attempt to brute force and log into that device. Okay, so we're proactively putting measures in place and monitoring those and ensuring that you don't have those externally available ports. So I like to think of it like this. Imagine a burglar walking down the street. He's looking at all the houses on the street. There's a house that has CCTV, great locks, all the windows are closed, a burglar alarm. They're probably not going to bother with that house. But a house that doesn't have those controls in place, that's a more opportunistic attack for a malicious actor. So there are some tools out there that attackers use where they can scan all publicly available ports in the UK, and they're just looking for businesses that don't have that right level of security in place. So there's opportunistic attacks for those houses that don't have security controls, don't have the CCTV, don't have the burglar alarm. So we're looking for those in our external recon. That pretty much concludes the EDR portion of this. So I've talked about why it's so important to protect our devices. The devices themselves that are running malicious processes, have those remote access methods for attackers that are deploying ransomware and getting those early warning signs, and proactively managing the external attack surface that is accessible to attackers. But next we have ITDR. So ITDR is identity threat detection and response. So as opposed to protecting the devices themselves, we also protect user identities. And this is specifically for Microsoft 365. So if we look here, we can see our active incidents categorized by their severity, and we can see some of the most investigated identities in our environment. So these are potentially some of the more high-risk identities that we're tracking and some of the incidents that have generated from those identities. So if we look at this specific user here, we can see Matt Kilch. We're looking at baselining Matt Kilch's regular behavior. And if he deviates from his normal behavior, that could indicate that there's potential malicious compromise. So Matt Kilch's baseline behavior, what he usually does, he usually logs in from the United States. He doesn't use a VPN. He uses the Chrome browser. Maybe he's always using a Windows device. He's logging in from the same IP address, the same location within the United States, the time that he's logging in, 9 to 5. If we start to identify abnormal behavior within this and pull those signals together, corroborate instances, we start to understand that there's potential malicious compromise there. So I'm going to jump into some examples here. So one of the things that we're looking for is malicious inbox rules. So imagine an attacker gained access to a CFO's inbox, their identity. What would that attacker want to do? They'd want to create some form of malicious inbox rule that said, if that CFO receives an email with the keywords payment, financial, transaction, invoice, redirect that email to an external domain that only the attacker has access to. So they can read the contents of all those emails that contain those keywords. So what would they potentially want to do with that information? They'd want to sell it on the dark web, like we talked about. They'd potentially want to hold that business to ransom and say, we'll release this information if you don't give us payment. They might stage some sort of financial transaction fraud, use that information to get the organization to pay erroneous invoices. Okay, so these are all things that we're looking out for in terms of malicious inbox rules. We've talked about how credentials make their way on the dark web. Okay, hopefully many of you aren't using the same password for your personal life and your work life. Using the same password for Facebook or Adobe or a fitness app. When that makes its way onto the dark web and the attackers buy that for a relatively small sum of money, they're testing that on businesses that you work for, your organizations. Okay, so we're looking at instances where it deviates from that normal user's behavioral baseline. Are they using a VPN that they don't normally use? Are they using a separate browser, a different operating system, a different location? Okay, and another one that we're looking for is attacker in the middle. Okay, this is a really, really common one that we're seeing at the moment, and hackers love it. The reason that they love it so much is because it's that perfect intersection between being extremely easy and extremely powerful. You can learn how to do this within an hour, and you can go out there and become a cyber criminal with relative ease. Okay, so I'm going to jump into this instant report and explain quickly how it works. So imagine a user receives an email that requests them to log into Microsoft 365. Okay, when they click on that link to log into Microsoft 365, they are redirected through the hacker's server and then to the Microsoft 365 portal. So when they input their credentials on the Microsoft 365 portal, it is the real Microsoft 365. Okay, username, credentials, MFA code. Microsoft grants a session token to that user that says they can log in. But with the attacker in the middle, because it's redirected through their server, they've intercepted that communication between the user and Microsoft 365. And once they have that session token, they can immediately paste that into their browser and log in as the user undetected, and the user is none the wiser. So essentially keys to the kingdom very easily with that attacker in the middle attack. And the reason it's so powerful is because you're not necessarily protected by MFA. A lot of people think MFA is the silver bullet protecting against, credential theft. But in this case, with the session token, the hacker can log in with ease. So we can look at this instant report here with the identity. We can see that the user is Annie Gamble. She typically logs in from Australia, but in this case, she's logged in from Estonia. We found additional telemetry that suggested this user has been successfully phished and the threat actor gained access to the identity. These are the measures we've taken, okay? We've temporarily disabled this user identity to deny the threat actor further access. So we're immediately taking that intervention to say, look, this attacker has used an attacker in the middle, attack type, compromised that user identity, and we've taken it offline to prevent further breach. And we've got our recommendations based on that. So to review Annie's mailbox, the browser history, identify any remnants of phishing, perhaps submit her for security awareness training, make sure she doesn't do this again, audit the activity going forward, enable conditional access, enforce MFA, rotate those credentials that we used. Okay, so these are the detection mechanisms that we're taking. We provide the evidence, and we also intervene to prevent that attack from worsening, as I showed the isolation of that identity. Okay, quarantining it like the COVID patient. Okay. So that concludes some of those detections there. Now I'm going to talk about unwanted access. So unwanted access is specifically around unauthorized geolocations, countries, and unauthorized VPNs. So we can manage country rules and access. So from this section here, we can essentially add a rule to say, for our organization, Springfield Power, we want to block all logins from Russia. Okay, very simple. We typically see a lot of organizations that want to block, the likes of Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, a lot of these countries that are heavily associated with cyber criminal activity. And if we have some exceptions in place, perhaps you have an office in the Netherlands or in Germany, you can list those countries specifically as well. So blocking and allowing countries based on our predefined rule set. Additionally, we also have VPN rules. So let's say within your environment, you have the FortiClient VPN. That's the VPN that you use. So we'll say that that rule is expected. There is no reason why any users in your organization should necessarily be using unsanctioned VPNs. If they're logging in from any other VPN other than the one that you sanction, we can block that user identity. So we commonly see a lot of these obscure VPNs that attackers are attempting to use. Hide my IP, hide me VPN. This is an interesting one here, hide my ass VPN. We know that if an attacker is attempting to log into your 365 environment whilst connected to this VPN, it's not necessarily good news. Okay. So those are our detections around unwanted access. Further to that, we also have rogue applications. So the types of rogue applications that we're looking for, stealthware and traitorware. So traitorware is essentially applications that have potentially good uses. They can be used for reasonable activities, but more often than not, we see them used by malicious threat actors. So one of the analogies I like to use is the crowbar. A crowbar can be used for, perfectly normal activity. It can be used by builders to get into things, okay? But if you saw someone walking past your house at midnight with their hood up, holding a crowbar, more often than not, you'd think that's used for some nefarious activity, okay? And we also have stealthware. So stealthware are applications that aren't necessarily seen before. They're relatively unknown, but they have very powerful permissions to perform actions that are generally associated with malicious actors as well. So we maintain our database of known rogue applications that attackers are using, and they use these applications because they're a lot more obfuscated than an attacker application. Something like Kali Linux, very egregious. We know that that is typically always a hacker. Okay, these can be somewhat masked a little bit. So when we look at EM client, what can that do? That's a fairly common email productivity tool that sometimes people use. But when attackers use it, they use it to download all emails from an inbox, mass mail spam, export calendars and contacts, and create inbox rules to stage financial transaction fraud. So this is a really common attack vector that an attacker would potentially use against a compromised identity. So let's refer back to that example before of the CFO with their inbox. If you gained access to a CFO's identity, what would you want to do? You'd want to download all of their emails and use that to sell on the dark web. Similarly, we have this other application here that can access and download files from all OneDrive and SharePoint that user can access. So again, that would be associated with data exfiltration, potentially malicious for selling on the dark web or holding an organization to ransom. So that fully concludes the demo of EDR and ITDR. And hopefully it's given you a little bit of education around why protecting your device is so important with regards to detecting those remote accesses, those malicious processes, and those early indications of ransomware, and then protecting the identities themselves against potential data exfiltration and compromise of inboxes. And I'll hand that over to Zoe.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. That's absolutely brilliant. And I suppose it's worth mentioning that since we started deploying Huntress on customers, we actually have stopped a couple of live ransomware attacks where something's actually had a bad actor on the network. And we had one where there was almost a zero-day vulnerability on a firewall, and they'd gone into the firewall, and it was within the patching policy, monthly patching for that firewall, and somebody was in a network and about to basically do some bad stuff. And the Huntress guys caught it, isolated the machine that they'd got on, and called our guys, and they sorted it. So, and we've also had the similar with a couple of email accounts that we didn't know were compromised, put the software on, and we found that a couple of those bad bits of software that he was talking about then have been installed on their tenant and we're taking data out. So it's a live example of where it's really helped, stop an active attack. We're pushing it to all our customers. If it's the one thing you buy this year to help secure your network, it's well worth doing. And it's not crazy money. So if you want to talk to us about it, give us a shout afterwards, talk to your account manager, and we can have a look at it for you. But yeah, more than happy to explain anything more about it, and I'm sure Alex would as well. So 1 minute to go. Thank you very much for your time, much appreciated. And thanks, Alex, for joining us. So have a nice rest of the day and enjoy the bank holiday weekend. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Hang on, Tom.